Hello, everybody, and welcome back. How did you guys like the video of Terence? All right. So I am here with two awesome people that I'm happy to call friends of mine as well, and they are going to have a virtual fireside chat. This is a coronavirus fireside chat, is what they call this.
But there's no fire.
Right.
You'll
No
just
fire.
have to imagine.
Right. We'll have to imagine the fire here. So yeah, welcome back, everybody. So the two people here, we have Erik Davis, who is a man of many talents. Some of you may know him from his podcast, Expanding Mind. He's also an author of several books, his most recent and the most relevant to this being High Weirdness. There we go. We got double. This is getting super weird here. Yeah. High Weirdness.
Why is it reversed in my view?
Things are getting weird, Dennis.
Things are getting weird.
Things have been weird for a long time.
So High Weirdness, Erik goes through the 70s, essentially, and Terence McKenna is one of the three main characters in it. And Erik will go through some of the tales he tells in that momentarily. And of course, we have Dennis McKenna, who, in addition to being Terence's younger brother, is also a very accomplished person in his own right, an ethnopharmacologist. Dennis was a founding board member of Hefter Research Institute. We did this ethnopharmacology conference called ESPD 50 a few years ago in the castle in England. That was fun. And Dennis also has a book about his life with Terence, which is called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And there we go on Erik's screen there. That is Dennis's book. So if you want to learn more about Dennis and Erik's life together, you can read it there in both of those books. But with that, I am going to close myself out of this and leave the floor to Erik and Dennis. So guys, take it away.
All right.
Okay, Mike. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for that intro, Mike. It's great. I'm really happy to be here. Psychedelic Seminars, doing work with these folks and the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. And then, of course, my old friend Dennis, and really psyched about the whole McKenna Academy thing. That's a really terrific project you got going there. But I got to say, I haven't really, I don't know how you are, but I actually don't listen to Terence or watch videos pretty much at all. I got a lot of Terence, and when he died, it was like, that was Terence. And then occasionally I'd listen to something to like get a refresher or whatever, but I hadn't really seen him. And this was a fine performance. I mean, it was, sometimes he could get a little raggedy, and this was just really spot on. He was sharp. A lot of it was just very, very solid. And when it started to get deep and weird, it just built really slowly. I mean, it was just a great reminder of what a wonderful guy he was to listen to, just let alone what the content of the ideas are, but just as someone to just hear him riff and remember. It's just it was really a great video.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it wasn't, I've seen him give better ones and worse ones. This was somewhere in the middle, but to me, the point was just to be able to show him back in the day, at Esalen in 1989. I mean, those were the golden days. And so it's really nice to see him like he was, I won't tell you all the mistakes he made. It's not my place to dissect this and correct the stuff about chemistry and plants and all that. I mean, Terence, that wasn't his bailiwick. It was fine. It was a great video, and it was great to see him, the way we'd like to remember him.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, I was.
And then you mentioned, Erik, you don't watch Terence's stuff on YouTube very much. I don't either, actually. I mean, I do sometimes if somebody points out something particularly that I need, but as a rule, I don't. But I think the interesting thing is that, YouTube came onto the internet after parents had passed on. And yet YouTube has become his kind of ticket to immortality. He is a active presence on the net, and it mostly comes through YouTube. And his ideas are so current, or in this case, I would have to say prescient, that he's totally part of the contemporary conversation. This is what amazes me, that, a guy who has not been alive for 20 years, we can get an event like this going and 5,000 people check in. So it just tells you he resonated with a lot of people, and he created a community that loves him, and I guess me to an extent as well. And I'm really moved by this. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was actually really moved in this video when Terence talked about love, because he didn't talk about it that often, at least the times I've seen him or listened to him. And you got a sense of the way in which plant practice, for all its challenges and its traps and delusions and politics and like everything else in the world, that there's a sort of quality of camaraderie, of kind of mutual respect and appreciation, this sort of tribal sense that we, growing up in the modern West, don't really have. We kind of find our tribal sense through subculture and through fandom. Being fans of people is one of the ways that we make that kind of connection. And definitely, Terence was someone really good about being, he was a great person to be a fan of, because he was very entertaining and very stimulating. And you felt like you were kind of like entering into a sort of secret world through hanging out and listening to him. It was like he was an entree to a whole kind of perspective. But for me, he was also just such a great guy to hang around. I mean, that's the thing. I met him very shortly after this video, was taken. I think it was 90 or 91, and in New York City. And we just kind of crossed paths, mutual friends. I was already writing about psychedelics and weird fringe stuff and UFOs and strange TV and whatever. I was already on the weird was my beat. So of course I'd hang out with Terence, and he was also just a great guy to hang out with. He was just super fun to talk with and get stoned with, and go out. And he was just a great. That was his stage. He wrote cool books. True Hallucinations, I think, is a particularly well-written, fascinating, rich book. But he was at home doing his raps, as he called them, and talking both to crowds and with friends.
I think he was able to talk to a huge crowd, and every person in the crowd felt like he was talking to them. It was a very personal manner that he had. And as you say, he was just fun to listen to, because he stretched people's imagination. And I used to tell him, humorously, not in a critical way, but I would sometimes say, what you say doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really matter, because it's the way you say it. And that's what people love. I used to tell him, you could read the phone book and people wouldn't, they'd be hanging on every word, because it's that mesmerizing, twangy voice that just grabs you. And
yeah, for me, it's the voice, but it's also, there's somewhere in between that. Like if you have like the concepts themselves, some of which are really interesting, some of which are kind of wiggy, and some of which are like, what? I can't even really quite follow it. But
right.
But then there's the voice, just the pure performance. But there's somewhere in between, which is the part that really I was trying to really kind of play with when I was writing about him in High Weirdness, which is the way that ideas play against each other and resonate and interweave and sort of set off these kind of sparkles. Like there was kind of he was creating a theater, or almost like a pinball game of like, you'd follow this thing as it bounced around and it started to make patterns, and the whole expression of a certain way of thinking. And it's not a way of thinking that's without content or just a bunch of, random cool ideas. It was actually, in my mind, very esoteric. He was kind of a magical thinker in the classic sense. I mean, for me, one of the keys to understanding where Terence was coming from is to understand that he was also obsessed with the history of Western magic, and particularly with John Dee. And I was really lucky. I saw one weekend a workshop in New York City. where he just went through all the esoteric history. It was all just about the Rosicrucian Enlightenment and John Dee and Gnosticism. It really wasn't very much about psychedelics, a little bit. And I was like, that way of being, like the magician who is both a scientist, working with natural forces, working with, like an alchemist, working with chemical processes, and an imaginative, poetic thinker. And those things are happening at the same time. So it's hard to see that now because people don't really think that way unless you're like in this sort of magical subculture. But Terence, for me, it was in that sense a kind of classic magus in his mixing of science, natural history, physical processes, and this larger imaginal world. And he mixed them and fused them in ways that were confusing, annoying to rationalists, a trap for literalists. Yeah, right. But for many of us, it was just the best high.
Yeah. Yeah. He invited people to stretch their imagination, to push the boundaries. And this was the interesting thing. He could talk about the most cockamamie ideas you can imagine. And he could present it in such a way that people would accept it. Or if not accept it, at least say, well, maybe that's possible. Maybe mushrooms really are from the stars, or this kind of thing. I'm here to tell you, they're not from the stars. I don't want to get into the reasons why, but they're not. They're remarkable things. But it's not that, or the idea, of the time wave, which he rode that horse for a long time. And it's very interesting. I think, if we look at our current sort of historical position here on the cusp of some kind of global change that, it's not the end of the world, not yet, but I think we all agree that the coronavirus, the pandemic, is going to change everything going forward, possibly for the better, but it's just interesting that, he anticipated so much. And in like the time wave was a very interesting construction, and I think in the end we have to admit that, it doesn't describe the structure of time, and what it does is it's a very interesting sort of representation of what Terence thought about time, and how it's a reflection of his mind, and his view of history and so on. But you can back up from that to a broader perspective, and you could say, well, the time wave was maybe not correct, and 2012 was not the year. On the other hand, if you look around now, you can sort of say, basically, he was right. If the premise is that things are just gonna get weirder and weirder and weirder. Here we are. There's proof of that.
And it accelerates, and like his model captured that quality, that mathematical quality of acceleration. The way I was never a big fan of the time wave. Like I thought it was kind of a curiosity, and it had some interesting prophetic potential. And I always just saw it as in some ways very much like the I Ching that he derived it from, in the sense that if you analyze the I Ching, there are all these interesting mathematical relationships. It's not just completely made up. It's not just a bunch of pictures like the tarot, where there are some interesting relationships and 10s and 12s and things like that. But for the most part, it's a bunch of images that are kind of brought together. The I Ching, you can go really far with the mathematical construction, but it's still an oracle. It's not, it's not a machine. It's going to produce that kind of knowledge or that kind of information. And so read as an oracle, that means read not literally, but prophetically or suggestively. The time wave is still a remarkable achievement. But I have a question for you about this. One of the interesting things about reading Brotherhood and looking at especially La Chorrera from your perspective, is, you go on to become a scientist. You're a heart. You actually know what you're talking about. You know the science. You know the chemistry.
Sometimes.
You work in science, so you actually know how science works as a social process and how facts get it, that kind of thing. So now, after all this time, and you generally, when you talk about a lot of these things, you offer kind of skeptical accounts. The mushroom did not come from outer space. Like, let me tell you guys, there's no reason to believe that reality would have ended on that day, because that's not how physics works. So you say a lot of that. But, and I think that there's another way of at least reading the book, where there's aspect of that, call it gnosis, call it, supreme psychosis, whatever you want to call the break represented by La Chorrera, that there's, in some sense, something there that you're not willing to completely go, that was a far out trip. Don't worry about it. It's in the past. And I'm just curious how you play with, how you inside yourself balance the sort of skeptical realism and the sense that there was something about the mystery that was revealed there or opened up there.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe it's just my reluctance to reduce all this to say, well, a couple of young men went to the Amazon, they ate too many mushrooms and they went bonkers. I mean, yes, that happened. But to say they went bonkers, which is fair enough to say, is also to dismiss all the content of what happened. It's like they went bonkers, so whatever happened to them has no value. I mean, it is by definition illegitimate because it came out of what some people might say was insanity. And I've struggled with this because if we look at the consequences of La Chorrera, they weren't what we expected. I mean, we did not crystallize a glowing, lenticular, mushroom-shaped object that was made of mind and matter. That didn't happen. But other things happened. For one thing, the simplest, and then nothing supernatural about it, but the thing that happened that came out of La Chorrera that actually had an effect, besides the fact that it eventually resulted in a platform for Terence's crazy ideas, or our crazy ideas. But the thing that really had an impact is we took the spores back with us, we fiddled around with it for a couple of years, and we figured out how to grow these things. And the reason, really, our motivation for wanting to do that, other than that we wanted access to the experience and connection with the mushrooms, which we were at that time convinced was, an intelligent entity. And I'm not saying it's not. I think it is. I just don't think it's extraterrestrial. But we wanted that connection, but also we wanted to get the mushrooms out to people so that they could have this experience and either confirm or disconfirm all the crazy stuff that was happening to us. And I think the jury's in. You take a lot of mushrooms in the right circumstances and weird shit happes.
Yeah, and you hear voices.
Some of
and
it is really hard to explain. So in that sense, it's a search for, it's almost like a plea in some ways. Don't dismiss this as simply a psychosis.
Yeah. Well, that was a lot of what my project was about. High Weirdness was based on my PhD. So I went to Rice. I decided to get a PhD, partly for the hell of it, partly because I got invited by a cool guy, Jeff Kripal. He made it clear that I could get away with whatever I wanted to do. Most religious studies departments, he would not, that you would not be able to write this book. But I wrote this dissertation and turned it into the book. And the way I wanted to approach it was like, I actually want to bring some really heavy duty stuff to bear on this. I want to bring scholarship, critical theory, anthropology, like cultural studies, like really hit it hard and hit it from an angle where, as I kept saying, take it seriously, but not literally. Mm-hmm. And what that means is to say psychosis is just a basket where we put things that we don't have anywhere else to put. And that's what the whole discourse of the weird that I talk about is. And it really points to what you're talking about, because for me, the weird is not the same thing as the supernatural or the mystical or the occult. Right. It's something that's more grounded, earthier, more secular, more naturalistic. So I believe that if you're a hard-headed naturalist, like you're into science, you don't believe in any other forces, whatever, but if you're paying attention, you have to acknowledge that reality is weirder than it seems and that your theories seem. If you're paying attention, there's an anomalous quality, and certain practices, including taking large doses of psilocybin mushrooms, can initiate into enigmas that, if you don't just shut them out, will pull the rug out or tug the rug out from under your naturalism. And that's what I call weird naturalism, that I really think, and this, the talk we just saw was great that way, because he really started out the first half an hour, 45 minutes that was just like anthropology, some slightly problematic, but nonetheless scientific approaches about chemicals and brains and no big deal, nothing. And then it just kind of builds and builds. And then suddenly we're talking about time, or we're talking about the matrix and animism and the voice. And you're like, how did I get here? So that to me is like weird naturalism in action.
Right. And I think that's part of the way I manage to balance these things, not necessarily all the time and not always gracefully, but I think one of the things that psychedelics teaches a person is how little we know. You know, science can be very arrogant about what it thinks it knows. It actually knows a very small slice of reality. And even though I'm a scientist and, identify with that, but I am also a psychedelic person. So I live in the knowledge of the limitations of science. Ayahuasca always tells me, it's like one of the main messages of the plant teacher, if you want to call it that. Remember how little you know. And the next thing it says is, so you have no excuse for arrogance, because actually you don't know much. Rather than being arrogant about how much we've figured out, we should be humble about how much there is left to understand about our place in reality, because I don't think it's nailed down at all.
Yeah, I think you just pointed out a really, really important dynamic in culture and in personality types too. I mean, you have people who fetishize rationalism and knowing, and the confidence that comes with knowing, and the arrogance that comes with knowing, the declaiming, I know, we're doing this, we must do this, and here's why, and and they really identify that, and that goes along with a lot of science. If you have guys like that, and ladies, they're going to make science. And on the other hand, then you have people who say, no, it's all a great mystery. We come from who knows where, we're going who knows where. And those people can fetishize the mystery and then become religious zealots, or they just have faith. It's like, you can't convince them anything. It's like, no, there's actually a virus moving through the community. It's like, no, God would never let them into the church doors. Come on in to worship. You're like, that's crazy. Why? Because it's like, you don't know. It's a mystery. And so one of the challenges we have is how do we do both? How do we respect and continue to do science and practice science, but in my mind, ultimately have that humility before the mystery, which you don't have to be religious about. It's just about a certain humility and openness and imagination about the edges of the known. And that to me, again, is where you and your brother, even though you have different bents, are very similar in that tension.
Yeah, that's the thing. The other side you referred to, the sort of, not tethered to any facts. I mean, it's my mind is made up. Don't confuse me with facts, sort of attitude. And we get a whole lot of that these days, the science deniers are, and that sort of thing. That's an instantiation of that attitude. It's not to say that science is the only way of knowing. It certainly isn't. I mean, there are other ways of knowing, and we need to be cognizant of that. But science is a powerful way of asking questions about nature and getting answers back that you can verify to the degree that you have the information. But the important assumption to sort of come to grips with is you can make hypotheses, you can make theories about the way things are. You can never prove a theory. You can disprove it. That's the thing. That's the way it works. You can disprove it, or you can say, in the light of the data that we have, this theory appears to be valid. Next week, more information may come in that will completely demolish your theory. That's the beauty of science. If it's practiced correctly, it's a way to expand our understanding of nature. And even though we have a very small amount of territory staked out, we can sort of nail down that small amount so far. Again, knowing that it may blow up completely if new information comes in. It's a very slow, incremental process, this attempt to understand nature scientifically.
For some reason, what's coming back to me right now is Terence's library. Anybody who was lucky enough to check out his library knows that you could learn a lot about Terence from his library. And when I went to Hawaii, when he was sick, about 6 months before he died, to interview him, he didn't have a lot of energy, so we'd talk for a while, and then he'd take a nap, and I was just hanging out. So I spent a lot of time in his library, and what was so fascinating was seeing the way that scientific texts, particularly natural history, tales of the explorers, but also books about nature and biology and plants, were kind of woven into this larger framework. So it's not that it was science, but it was also connected to poetry, or it was connected to images. For example, like Terence was really kind of a naturalist of the psychedelic realm. Like he was sort of like, if you look at the cover of True Hallucinations, it looks like a 19th century Victorian account of going to the jungle. And in some ways, I think he identified with that archetype of the kind of Western person who has skepticism and reason and knowledge, but he's going into this exotic other world to discover these marvelous things that, for Terence, were ultimately about this other realm, like this realm with tykes and multidimensional castles and, vaulted ceilings of whatever, cosmic dimensions. But he had that kind of attitude. And so there's this element of like the respect for evolution, for naturalism, for nature as a constant process that's almost sort of animated. It is animated with its own intelligence and patterns. But then looking at his library, then you look across, in the next shelf over is like the diagrams from Ernst Haeckel, which are like trippy pictures of nature. And you look at him and you go, okay, these are actual things. This guy was a scientific illustrator, but it's the late 19th century and it's kind of trippy. In fact, it's super psychedelic. And then next to that, you're like reading science fiction, and then you're off into theosophy. And there was some way in which he could speak from that whole library, like as someone who could sort of bring in all of these elements, but including the science. So that was always something that I kind of enjoyed, even if it got squirrely at times, was that way that he was still, an explorer, an adventurer within a kind of naturalistic framework.
Yeah, I agree. He was an incredibly eclectic intellect. He wove all of these things together. But I think, what you say, that if we practiced anything, if there was a metaphysical grounding to what we were doing, I think your idea of weird naturalism is absolutely true. We went after this, at least back in the day when we did the experiment in La Chirera, correctly or incorrectly, I think we really did conceive of those dimensions as other dimensions, places you could go, and therefore part of the natural continuum. maybe not in 3D space, maybe not on Earth, but somehow part of the fabric of reality that you could penetrate and spend time in with the right tools. And the right tools were, of course, psilocybin and ayahuasca and these other things. And it goes back to, a point, many points, many times in your discourse, you're sort of unpacking of the experiment at La Chouera, the whole McKenna mythopoesis or whatever, is that it wasn't spiritual. We weren't trying to, our approach was naturalistic. We were not trying to put this in the context of any religion or any tradition or indigenous knowledge or anything. And rightly or wrongly, we were making this up as we go along, and it came directly from the interactions with the psychedelics. We were not seeking enlightenment or spiritual advancement or anything like that. We were approaching this like physicists, like biophysicists. The mushroom or our own fantasies or whatever it was, they were telling us how to build a machine, made out of our own minds, our own body, DNA, and, an artifact, but an artifact that would be an intelligent artifact and partly made out of mind and matter. But we approached it as an engineering project, essentially, and the mushroom downloaded the blueprints to do that. Now, as it turned out, we carried out the protocol, and because, for various reasons, it couldn't happen. I mean, what we expected to happen was absolutely impossible in any universe. Probably, it didn't happen. But we operated in the expectation. This was the thing. We got into this very peculiar relationship with time leading up to the experiment, and all of these crazy things were happening. We took that as proof that a few hours up ahead, we'd carried out the experiment and it had succeeded. So we had painted ourselves into a corner here. It had to succeed, and yet it couldn't succeed. So when we did the experiment, and the mushroom didn't explode in a crystal of superconductive matter or anything like that, it didn't happen. Instead, we had that very transient vision, which we shared, where looking at the mushroom, we could both see at the same time that it was the earth, and it was perfectly bifurcated between night and day. And we'd had the assumption all along that this whole thing was being orchestrated by some, as I think we even said, dome-headed beings in geosynchronous orbit. And so it was like a confirmation of that in a certain way. So what we predicted was going to happen couldn't possibly happen. But we'd already succeeded. We knew it was going to happen. So something had to give. We had to blow a gasket somewhere. And that's exactly what happened. We blew a gasket. But again, I don't think that, I've thought about this. That, again, in your analysis of this, you remark several times on our reluctance to just reduce this to a psychosis and say much more about it. We insist that something happened, right? Something happened beyond just going bonkers on a bunch of drugs. And I still cling to that. I think something did happen. If you look at the societal impact of bringing mushrooms into the world, making it available to anyone with enough patience to grow the little suckers, and that's pretty easy, that made a big difference in society. But then, I have a talk I give occasionally called the Experiment at La Chouera, Psychotic Break, Shamanic Initiation, or Alien Encounter. And you may or may not have seen it. I gave it a breaking. And in that, I'm kind of leaning toward the idea of alien encounter. I mean, there was definitely psychosis. There was definitely altered states involved. But if you look at the classic sort of, the classic characteristics of your typical alien encounter, I mean, that's kind of an oxymoron, but your typical alien encounter has various elements to it. And we ticked all the boxes in a certain sense. I mean, there was a siren song, that drew us to the Amazon. There were gifts that were received in the form of information and the spores. There was, an element of absurdity. And, it didn't get more absurd than when Terence saw the flying saucer that was right out of George Adamski's living room, out of his dark room, this faked photograph. There it was, 300 feet across. So Jacques Vallée has also talked about this, how, what you think is happening is not what's really happening. It's deliberately, whatever the phenomenon is, it's presenting itself so as to baffle you and really throw you off your, knock you back on your heels, so you get to a place where you don't know what the hell is going on. And
absolutely.
That was kind of
one of how it was, right? Yeah, one of the things I was really interested in checking out is, for again a secular person, critical, skeptical, looking at this stuff, they go, look, they're just making it up. It wasn't even, whether or not psychosis, I don't even know what that is. But if you look at all the elements, that comes from a science fiction book, and they were Lovecraft fans, and they liked UFO magazines, and their father subscribed to Fate, and they were, so you can see all the pieces. And what's great about particularly True Hallucinations and the way that Terence tells the tale, where he goes in and he starts talking about how he recognized that there were all of these elements from his own mind and his own past that were being brought forward. But instead of going, oh yeah, well, I guess I must be making it all up, he was like, no, but something is putting them together in a certain pattern, as if that the content is from us, is from our own minds and our culture and our experience and what we've read and what we've seen. But the pattern that it makes is too suggestive of other orders of alterity, of otherness, to be able to just write off as just something that you're kind of creating. And I think that's a wonderful rejoinder to the attempt to reduce everything to just something in your head. You're like, it's being put together, and it's too ingenious. Yeah. Which is what Vallée would say as well.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's also important to remember that everything you experience is in your head. So we can get into that. I mean, people talk about these phenomena, undoubtedly you've read Jeffrey Kripal's book, Supernatural, a new model or something for the unknown. And, he talks about Whitley Strieber's experiences and makes it clear. I mean, I think everything happened to Whitley Strieber that he says happened. He experienced it, so it's real. Now we can start saying, okay, but was this a hallucination? Was this in his head? Were there really blue elves that were coming into his bedroom? You can ask all these questions. But the raw datum of experience of it is whatever you experience is real, in the sense that you experience it. And that's an important, marker to put. And then you can begin the discussion of, is it inside? Is it outside? Is it somebody else? Is it my own memories and a part of myself that's presenting itself as something other? You can try to dissect all that.
I got a question for you about Terence. One of the interesting things about the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide that you guys came up in your pseudonymous way, is that it's funny because it's mostly extremely practical. It's very just technical science, pragmatic, nothing weird. But it's also the place that Terence writes perhaps the weirdest thing he ever wrote, which is like where he actually takes on the voice of the mushroom. And he kind of expresses like, here's the deal, kids. We come from space. You know, take us on. We'll show you, we'll download plans for intergalactic machines and we can fly and you know, like it's this total science fiction. It's a mixture of like, you know, Olaf Stapleton level science fiction with like the medieval pact with a you know, a demon or a daemon. And it's just a kind of extraordinary passage. There are certain points in Terence's life, in conversations I have, where I got the very strong sense that he always sort of kept that pact, like he had faith. But there was kind of an entity that he was behaving sort of like he was holding up his side of the bargain, if you will. And that sometimes it would waver. I'm curious, like how much do you see him, like at a very deep level, as being motivated by that kind of faith, exactly by that conviction, or that holding your end bargain. Or do you think that he would like fast switches of like no, maybe, or, you know?
Hey Eric, we got some technical problems here. Where's our manager? You're sounding very strange. I don't know if I am.
Hey guys, yeah, you're sounding strange, but it's kind of funny. It's kind of hilarious and fitting for this whole thing.
There we go. Yeah, it sounds okay to me.
But maybe, yeah, we can't understand.
Yeah, you might want to try muting and unmuting your mic. It is kind of hilarious, though, and very fitting. So
fitting, yes.
We're talking about high weirdness here.
Well, you sound okay, and I think I sound okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we have here.
Well, you're back.
How's that?
Oh, now you sound okay.
Okay, sorry about that. It didn't sound weird to me.
Not your fault.
It's
always the technology that screws things up, right? I mean, at a critical moment, the technology will turn on you. You can count on it every time. At least that's been my limited experience. But anyway, back to what you were saying.
I was just asking whether you believe that Terence always sort of kept faith with this pact, this idea that there was a kind of pact made with the mushroom, or whether it was something that would vary in his life and later he left it alone, or whether that was something that he carried with him throughout his life.
I think that he had doubts later on in his life. I think that was part of his existential dilemma, in a way, both with the time wave and with this sort of connection to the logos that you talk about, the voice in his head, which he took to be the mushroom, or the intelligence behind the mushroom. I mean, I think he was forced to question those things, and I think it was uncomfortable. But that's what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you muted your camera? Is that the problem?
Are you talking about me again? Did you lose the camera as well?
Yeah, no, I can hear you fine. I just don't see your image anymore.
I do see you, Eric.
Now it's just me. I think Eric's probably going to come back. So far, so good.
So what do you say? You want to go to some questions? I've been kind of scanning occasionally on the chat line. It's pretty hilarious. I like all the responses to my verbal intervention. Actually, one time I was calling Terence on the phone from here when he was in Hawaii, and he had this like weird satellite rig for his telephone system. And it was, it was bouncing away. It was some kind of, I don't remember exactly how it worked, but it was unusual. And at one point there was a audio error, and it sounded suddenly like he was in an infinite echoing room of cosmic proportions. It was like one of the trippiest sounds I'd ever heard. So you just never know. When you get noise on the line, the noise might be something else.
That's true. That's true.
So what do you say, Mike? You want to get on here and start?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it was actually kind of fitting. It was weirdly appropriate. Yeah, actually, yeah. Before I start taking questions, I do want to just drop in to some quick announcements for folks here. Actually, if folks could pause the chat for just a quick second, I'm going to send you a couple of important links real quick, and then we'll start hopping the questions in. So, some important notes. This event is continuing. There are more tribute to Terence events coming. That is going to continue tomorrow with Bruce Damer is on tomorrow with Luis Eduardo Luna. So check it out. We just put the link in the chat. That is where you can find the event tomorrow and for the following 2 Saturdays after that. So check out the link that we just sent if you want to tune into the event tomorrow and the next few weeks. I'm also going to throw in the chat links to both Erik and Dennis's books if you want to check those out there. So just some quick things there. And now we can start doing the questions.
Wait, I just want to say one thing that I also just came out with the audiobook of High Weirdness that I'm really proud of because I read it. And it's a dense book, and I think it's actually probably better to listen to me do it. It's more fun. It's more like having a wacky professor like go through the history of esoteric 70s and drugs and comic books and all this kind of stuff. As a tome, it's a bit dense, but so but your mileage may vary.
Yeah. Sorry, I meant to mention that. Yeah, get the audiobook. You should probably get that from the same link. Actually, I think Amazon lets you also select audiobook, so you can find that on there as well. So let's pop into the questions. So the top voted question is actually, who were Terence's favorite musicians?
Well, I can hazard a guess. At least I know 2 bands that he liked. One was Pink Floyd. Because of the saucer cosmic connections. The other was the Grateful Dead. No real surprises there. And then, when, in the 60s, he was a fan of Bob Dylan's and the Beatles. I guess we all were. I don't really know. What else did he like, Erik? You remember? I know those 2 stood out. And,
it was never clear to me how much he liked all of the EDM that became part of his whole shtick in the 90s when he was sort of taken up in that world. I think he liked the scene, he liked but whether he actually liked the music, I'm not sure. I kind of doubt it.
I don't think he did. Yeah. I think he enjoyed being sort of all the accolades and. He could go to raves or attend them, and he could say, well, I'm easily the oldest person in the room, and there were 20,000 people in the room, so I don't really know, but I think I know that those 2, the Grateful Dead and Pink Floyd, were big for him.
Solid choices. So the next question is for Dennis. What book or books would you say have been the most impactful or influential for you and Terence? And how old were you when you read these books?
Well, certainly, I would say Psychology and Alchemy was a big influence on both of us. And Terence told me when I was 16, and before I'd taken LSD, he said, read Psychology and Alchemy before you take LSD. It will make it so much more rich for you. Of course, I ignored that, but after reading Psychology and Alchemy, I understood why he said that. And then, it feels, this sort of goes back to what we were talking about the experiment at La Chirera and so on. I think that science fiction was a big influence on Terence and me. And, you would think it would be some great book, but there's some amazing and influential science fiction books out there. And they were quite front and center when we were at La Chirera. You said something, Erik, that I thought was brilliant, which is when we did the experiment, we were doing a we thought we were doing an act of science. Actually, we were doing an act of science fiction. And looking back on it, it's amazing to me how many of the tropes of science fiction were interwoven throughout that whole experience. You know, the city in the stars was a big part of it. The movie Charlie, which had come out, was a big part of it. You know, in some sense, it was either it's a pathetic commentary on how deeply we were immersed in science fiction, you know, or you can look at it the other way. I mean, it's interesting if you look, for instance, of the career of Philip K. Dick, which you also write about in your book, and I haven't read it, but I'm sure it's brilliant. You know, if you look around today at what's happening, it's like we're in a Philip K. Dick novel. Yep. I mean, everything is just fucking weird. Let's face it. More things don't make sense anymore. You know, I mean, and it's interesting that Terence, you know, checked out. He left the scene before the 21st century actually started, because it started, you know, on January 1st, 2021, right? And everything that's happened since, he was not witness to, you know, and all the crazy things. And when I think about what he would think about what's going on now, if he looked around, I think in part he would be dismayed in some ways, but also completely unsurprised. You know, and he would say, well, what did I tell you? This is what we've been talking about. And it's like, whether or not the time wave actually describes something, in that sense, he's right. You know, things have gotten very, very peculiar. And I think everyone has a sense that, you know, we're in a surreal reality now.
I think one thing he would be really psyched about, that the talk that we saw, the Esalen video had elements of, is the way in which an essentially animist attitude towards nature, that there's some intelligence that is actually able to communicate in some ways that's in nature, that those ideas are, believe it or not, marching closer and closer to more even mainline approaches to at least natural history. It's still fringe, but it's real. Before it was just not even on the stage. And now it's like, well, you know, they're actually intelligent. In fact, if you think of like all the definitions of intelligence, plants kind of fulfill them all. And so, okay, so there's this kind of animism that's going on the edges of our understanding of the natural world, at least, you know, people who have that kind of tendency, that is pretty radical and pretty fascinating. Then I always figure that that's like the key part of the weird naturalism. If you might not be supernatural, might not be into gods and spirits and all that kind of stuff, but if you can bring that kind of openness to the possibility that nature has something to say, and that part of what we're doing is building a kind of interface where there's some kind of pattern recognition, some kind of transition between us. The fact that there's sort of more and more scientists who are willing to talk that way, as indigenous knowledge is recognized as a valid approach towards dealing with natural history, that there's more and more happening. And also as other people just come to see it as one of the ways of relating to the natural world. So I find that, and actually kind of the technological world too, but that's another more Phil Dickian story. But I think that part he would be really heartened by.
Yeah, I think so too, and it's true. I mean, science is coming closer and closer to the indigenous worldview. I mean, it's interesting how these things are migrating together, because in the indigenous perspective, animism, everything is intelligent. Even electrons are intelligent, and they're intelligent in the sense you tell by the way these things adapt. And plants are a good example. You know, they don't have nervous systems, they don't have brains, but their strategies for living evince a certain kind of intelligence. And as physics migrates toward the indigenous worldview, I think this is actually closer to the way it really is. And this is a wonderful thing, because what it means is it's not just a cold, dead universe. It's not just molecules and atoms randomly tumbling around in space. There is actually more to it than that. You know, there's something underlying it, an inherent intelligence that may be at the most fundamental roots of reality. You know, that consciousness is primary, that the universe is here because the universe is an idea, in a sense, of not of humans, but of something. And, you know, I think the universe is, it's intelligent. It is it itself. I don't believe in God as such, as some external agency. I think the universe itself is an intelligence awakening to itself. And that's the closest thing to God. And I think that can be argued scientifically even. You know,
got another question, Mike?
Yes, we do. Yeah,
the nuts and bolts of quantum mechanics, but you can make that case, you know.
Yeah, and we got and I saw some questions come in on the chat window as well. So if you are putting your questions in the chat, make sure you put them in the actual question area. There's a little button you'll see on the bottom of your screen that says "Ask a Question." Put your questions in there, and we're going to go with the most upvoted ones. And the next question that was the most upvoted is, what are your thoughts on our current situation? Not only coronavirus, but other increasingly weird and inexplicable events, like your microphone going off. Also with psychedelic therapy becoming increasingly popular and discussed more often in the news and social media, what are your thoughts on recreational use? Is recreational use ever appropriate? And do you think psychedelic substances should be accessible legally outside of a therapeutic setting? So kind of three questions.
I'll jump in on the latter part. I'm still processing what's happening now. Like the whole talking. I mean, I can talk about how I'm processing it, but I don't. It's not like I have a lot of real good ideas about it, because we're in that mystery situation where all the science we throw out isn't very good because the data sucks and we don't really know what's going on, and politicians are making moves, and I mean, the whole thing is really. It's a fog of war situation, but it's not a war. But just to kind of, you know, actually, there's one thing that I want to just raise about the situation that I think is interesting. I don't think I have anything too much to say about it, but if you think about it, how does this condition reflect the climate crisis? Or the long arc of some of these things that Terence is talking about, and that he talked about in this thing about the environmental catastrophes that are lying ahead, that are already starting to happen. So in some ways, the virus is a very interesting thing to happen for a couple of reasons. One is that we don't have a very good, rich cultural story about pandemics. It's like, when we go to school as we're a kid, World War I. Oh, the trenches were terrible. Didn't have to happen. Then there's the Roaring 20s, and then the Depression. And like, okay, well, there's the Spanish flu. And like, I had my great grandmother and her brother died of Spanish flu. They lived in San Francisco, where I live. So I'm very aware of that story. But a lot of people just don't even know that story because we don't. Yeah, the Black Plague and da-da-da, but we don't really think about it as like an option. So if you said to somebody 5 months ago, hey, you know, and by February, things are going to be really screwed up all around the world, what's it going to be? Well, it would be some like technological catastrophe, or maybe a solar flare that takes out all the electricity or something. But the virus is this interesting blend of like human culture problem politics and nature doing what nature does. So it gives us a very interesting kind of, I don't know, and that's why I'm just trying to sit with the question, but there's something, I don't want to say it was necessary to happen this way, but since we're meaning making creatures, we mythopoeticize whether we want to or not. Let's do it with our eyes open. There's some kind of juice here that speaks to both our technological and political situation and the relationship with nature that's kind of profound and enigmatic and also kind of a drag and hard to think about and sort of scary.
So it's because we're living through this pandemic and all that it means for the future. It's hard to know how to determine it, but Terence's millennial eschatological speculations were very much about the end of the world. What does the end of the world look like? I don't think the world is ending, but I think the pandemic is giving a preview of how it might go, and it's reminding us of a few. It's actually, the pandemic is actually very gentle, considering what it could be. Wait for the next one. When we get something like Ebola that's airborne transmitted, then we got problems. We got real problems. This one is mild, and the infrastructure that supports the response to it is, as strained as it is, it still hasn't completely collapsed. Maybe in a month or so, things will go very much more worse. But I think the virus is one thing reminding us about climate change, because these tropical viruses emerge out of the rainforest, and as climate changes, that helps their global proliferation. So I think that's part of it. And the virus, talking about intelligence, the viruses are not intelligence, but in a certain way, maybe they are. Maybe it's a hive mind or something. It is, in any case, reminding us of something that we tend to forget, which is we monkeys are not running the show. Nature is running the show. And, this is the lesson that ayahuasca brings home every time. You monkeys only think you're running the show. We're not running the show. Nature is running the show. And necessarily it's, we exist in the context of that process. But I think the virus is, in some ways, we couldn't ask for a more benign, sort of reflection of what the future might yield. It's like the virus, it's like nature is coming and say, well, this is nothing. This is a demo. This is the trailer. Wait till the movie starts. You're not going to like it. And I think it's giving us an opportunity to try to get our act together and change. We've got to pull our elbows in somewhat. And in some ways, on the social level, this is already happening. It's amazing how people are following the guidelines, and I'm locked down like everybody else, but we're not totally locked down here. But just the social interactions you see go on, people are much kinder to each other. And I think there's a sense that, hey, we're all in the same boat here. This is a global thing. It's going to impact the world. And that's different than any other disaster any of us have ever lived through. It hasn't happened since the Spanish flu or the influenza of 1918. We've never seen a global event that comes close until the coronavirus came along. Mm-hmm. And now we have to relearn those lessons. Why does nobody talk about the pandemic of 1918 through 1920? I think because it was so traumatic, it was just shoved under the rug. And people say, okay, that's over. Let's get on with the roaring 20s. Let's go back to where we were before. Maybe we'll do that, but I hope not, because I think
agree.
We've got to wake up, and this is a big wake-up call.
Got another one, Mike?
Yeah, I do. All right. Oh, there was a second part to that question, actually, and it was about your thoughts on recreational use and using psychedelics. Is it okay to use psychedelics not in a therapeutic legal setting?
I personally think that it depends on how you want to define therapeutic use, recreational use. There are many contexts in which you can use psychedelics. I don't automatically condemn recreational use. I'm not even sure what that means. If you look at the word recreation, which is often the way people use it, that's legitimate. The important thing about, I think there needs to be a context, a vessel, if you will, in which you put the psychedelic experience. But whether that's a therapeutic experience with a therapist, or a shamanic experience, or locking yourself in the basement and taking 5 grams in the dark, it's really up to you. You know, as long as you approach it respectfully and thoughtfully. The important thing is the work goes on in the interaction between you and the medicine. And you can select many different contexts for having that experience, and they're all legitimate because it's such an individual thing. I think the most important thing is make sure you choose a setting and a set that is not dangerous. I mean, don't take it on the freeway at 70 miles an hour. You know, don't do dumb stuff with it. And give it the respect it's need. Take it in a context where the job is to pay attention to the trip. You know, not an adjunct to something else. The trip, pay attention. You know, and that's the important thing. But whether you want to pay attention in a hospital room, in a clinic, around a campfire, alone, you know, it's up to you. Just common sense, and that's my answer to that.
Yeah, thanks. So the next question is, why did Terence stop taking psychedelics at the end of his life?
Well, it's not clear. And this has been a bone of contention in lots of ways. Number one, it's not clear that he ever really did stop taking psychedelics. And he may have stepped back from psychedelics at a certain point and started taking them much less. I think that I think that this was part of his coming to, a place where he was maybe questioning some of his assumptions, and that's a healthy thing. The assumption that the mushroom, the voice in his head, really is the voice of the Logos, I mean, that's what he was convinced of for years. Whatever that voice was, he learned a lot from it, but he may have reached a point where it wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear anymore, or maybe it wasn't telling him anything anymore, and that must be very disturbing. Same with the time wave. He reached a point where other people were beginning to point out that there were inherent flaws in the time wave, and he didn't really want to accept that. And I understand that. He devoted much of his life, but that's the nature of science. You have to be willing to admit that you're wrong and accept new data that changes the paradigm. And that's one reason why the time wave, as beautiful as it is, it's not science. It's not a theory. It cannot be disproven, and it can't be proven. So that's the issue. I mean, it's not clear. There may have been personal reasons why he didn't, but I don't think anybody can really criticize Terence about that. We all have to come to terms with how we're going to relate to psychedelics. And at a certain point, you may come to a point where you think, well, I got the message, so I'm hanging up the phone, and maybe that's what Terence felt he needed to do.
Yeah, thanks. So the next question here is, was there ever something that you and Terence disagreed about in regards to psychedelics? And if so, how do you see that disagreement today?
Was there ever something we disagreed about? Well, I don't know. Lots of things, I suppose. I mean, I had a different view of it. Eventually, like I say, I I never really believed that mushrooms were extraterrestrial, and I think you could make a pretty strong case that they're not. Much easier to make than the case that they are. I think our understanding of what the experience is probably evolved as well. I can't, it wasn't a question of disagreeing, and it's more a question of interpretation. And we had different interpretations for what these experiences might be, but we weren't arguing in that sense. These were more discussions, because let's face it, we were dealing with one of the, psychedelics are among the strangest things that can happen to people, and they're also some of the most significant things that can happen to people. As all the research on psilocybin in the clinical setting illustrates, and Roland Griffith's group and so on, they often are among the most meaningful experiences that people will have in their lifetimes. That's pretty significant. What are the other experiences that even come close? Well, I would say being born is important. Having sex or making love for the first time, that's pretty important. Dying, that's important. And psychedelics is right up there with those three. And another interesting thing about psychedelics in comparison to those things is you can't pay somebody to do this for you. You have to do it. You have to confront the medicine in yourself in the context of that space. You can't say, I can tell somebody, go off and take this unknown psychedelics, send me a full report. That's great. But if I want to know what it really does, I have to take it myself. And psychedelics are the most personal, one of the most personal things that you can do in a lifetime. And I think that's part of its significance. It's meaningful. It's really meaningful. And that's another aspect of it. People long for meaning. And there is so much in the world that is bull crap, that is not meaningful, including most of what religion tells us. So people want genuine, actual, meaningful experiences, and psychedelics can bring that to people under the right circumstances.
Nice.
Well, nothing for the short answers here.
That's all right. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions here. Okay. We have a question here. I think the world really needs a Terence McKenna archive that is as complete as possible. I worry about losing content that isn't digitized. Could you speak on this? There's currently a GoFundMe for a TM archive.
I wish I could talk to my friend Kevin Whitesides right now, because he was doing some of that work at some point. There are complete bibliographies out there. There are definitely archivists who are on top of it. Dennis is working with some other archives, and I'm curious to hear what he has to say. There's no central repository. And at some point that'll be necessary. It's going to take a lot of work, because there's a lot of tapes out there. They have different names. There are different qualities. You get into some of the Grateful Dead taping problem thing, except you don't have the Betty tapes. Nobody's got like the soundboards in the room. It's kind of a mess, and it's hard to know when they're from. And that's one thing that's important if you do an archive, is like what year things are in and how they unfold. But I want to hear what Dennis has to say about stuff that's happening. But I know that the things are happening, albeit at a slow pace.
Yeah. Well, everything you say is true, Erik. It is kind of a mess. There is no central repository, and one of the problems here is that, if there was ever to be a Terence McKenna archive, it would have crystallized around his library, because his library was so much about him. And he made that bequest to Esalen. And there was going to be a library at Esalen, the Terence McKenna Library, and that would have been the core of the archive. Well, that was taken away from us. And nobody's fault. I mean, it was lost in a fire and it's gone. So the only thing that's left about that library is the bibliography, which is incomplete. That is available online. So that's part of the archive. And then there are various scattered pieces. There is this psychoactive substances archive project at Purdue, and some of Terence's material is there. Some of it is my material is there. A lot of the notebooks from La Chirera and this sort of thing. Then there's my own digital archive, sort of. A gentleman named Logan Scott in Mill Valley is curating my, what I have. But again, I don't have a huge library, so it's not crystallizing around it. This is interesting that you should raise it, because this is one of the projects I want to approach through the McKenna Academy, which is the idea that we could reconstruct Terence's library in some way. The bibliography is out there, and that's probably 90% of what was in his library. If people have these editions, if they have these books and they want to donate it to the library or to the academy, that would be a way to kind of resurrect the library. And since the academy's mission is educational, I think this would be a tremendous project. And if if you like this idea, then let's talk about it. We're not here right now, not in this time. We're not trying to monetize anything. This is just a gift from me and Terence's friends to our community. But a project like that, it wouldn't even cost that much. It's just a matter of putting it out there and getting people on board. And that's one thing that one among several things I'd like to do, but that very much falls in the mission of what the Academy is all about, which is to recreate a mystery school, to have it be the first psychedelic university in the Western world since Eleusis, right? Eleusis was sacked and burned by the Goths in 396 AD. And that was the end of the psychedelic mystery schools. It was both the longest lived and the most prominent of them. Well, now we need a rediscovery of the tradition of the mystery schools, in which the plant teachers were on the faculty, if you will. They were part of the learning curriculum. Was the mission of the mystery schools. In a certain sense, I think the mission of the mystery schools was to teach us how to use our minds. They were to teach us how to think. We need something like that because people have forgotten how to think. And so, this is maybe an approach to that. Anyway, but that's a project that could be undertaken. Nothing supernatural or physics defying needs be done to reconstitute that library as much as possible.
Yeah, thanks. And I also want to give a shout out to someone in our audience here, Lorenzo Haggerty. If you're looking for Terence McKenna
Thank
archives,
you, Lorenzo.
He's got a lot of audio archives of all kinds of, hundreds of Terence McKenna talks. So check out the Psychedelic Salon. I believe it's psychedelicsalon.com or whatever podcast you use. It's a very long running, great podcast. Thank you, Lorenzo, for that. We are now clocked over our 75 minutes. So I think we've reached the end of our time here, but there's a couple of things I would love to tell people, because there is more. There is more. And so actually, if folks could pause the chat for just a quick moment, we're going to send you the links because there's another talk happening tomorrow and for the next couple of Saturdays. So tomorrow we've got Bruce Damer and Luis Eduardo Luna. The following Saturdays, Paul Stamets and Wade Davis, and then Rupert Sheldrake and Ralph Abraham. They're going to resurface the trialogues there. So the McKenna Academy is on this chat, and they can drop in the link to that. So that's a different Crowdcast link, but still right here in Crowdcast, and I'll drop that into the chat right now. It's crowdcast.io/e/tribute to Terence. And, I actually might pop myself back on the screen here for a second to say our final hello. So if folks are wanting to continue the conversation here, Psychedelic Seminars has a Facebook group, so I'll make a thread dedicated to continuing the conversation that's happening here. So that's facebook.com/groups/psychsems, PSYCHSEMS. And that's a place you can go if you want to continue the conversation. But yeah, please make sure you check out the other channel for the rest of this series that's brought by the McKenna Academy and the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. Erik and Dennis, did you guys have any final things you wanted to share?
I just want to thank you for setting this up. This was really a blast. It was great to, think about Terence again. It's, part of my life, part of my mind, and part of my work. And so it was really good to hang out, and it really enjoyed the chats, and it was good.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, same thing. And Mike, thank you for stepping up and making this happen. Erik, it's been tremendous. I think I've seen you more in the last week as we went through our various tech checks, but I'm loving your book, and I hope everyone reads it, and I hope we can do more things like this. And as for the audience, my God, I can't believe it. You guys, this I'm just so moved. There is such a wonderful community of spirit here. Thanks to all of you. I probably won't go on to the Facebook chat. I've been talking for an hour, but I hope you can come back tomorrow, and we'll continue with Bruce Damer and Luis Eduardo Luna, and we'll just go on from there. So this has been everything I hoped, and I hope it's been good for everyone. Even if you didn't get your chat questions answered, you can always bring them up again.
Yes. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. A special thank you also to Noel Imperato for the video of Terence and for gifting that to the community. And of course, a big thank you, Dennis and Erik, both of you guys, for being here today and having this chat. This was great. And thanks to the machine elves for chiming in as well over Erik's microphone.
Ever present there on the edge, but they're
they made their presence known here. If we had a doubt, now we know. And quick note: a year from today is 4-3-2-1. Blast off day. So note that in your calendar. I'll see you next year.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, before then too. Thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for being here, and see you soon. May the force be with you.
How do we get out?
I'll let you out.
Okay.